Hello and welcome. CCS Fundraising would like to thank you for joining us today for our conversation entitled Reimagining Your Fundraising. My name is Brian Leamy, and I'm the Head of Corporate Marketing and Business Development here at CCS. Over the course of the past 6 weeks, CCS has partnered with a variety of nonprofits, associations, and service providers to regionally convene dozens of virtual discussions, webinars, and roundtables. These sessions have all been designed to help the nonprofit community cut through the uncertainty presented during these trying times. Today, in the second installment of our global webinar series on navigating the challenges presented by coronavirus, a panel of senior leaders from CCS will share observations since the outset of the COVID-19 crisis, and will also share initial findings from the recent survey of nonprofit leaders that CCS conducted. Special thanks to all of you who participated in that survey. Because we have nearly 2,000 registrants for this session, we are broadcasting as a webcast, which means that computer audio is our only available audio option. At the end of the presentation, we will conduct a Q&A session. Thank you again to all of you who have submitted your questions in advance. And for those who have questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the chat box located on your admin panel as seen pictured here. After this meeting is concluded, we will share a recording of the webinar as well as the presentation with all of our registrants. And we will reach out with a response to anyone who submitted a question that was not addressed today. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the chairman of CCS Fundraising, Bob Cassane, who will be joined by Pete Hoskow and Miriam Droller. Bob?
Thanks, Brian. And hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this second webinar on the COVID-19 pandemic. As Brian mentioned, we conducted our first webinar several weeks ago. It was actually 5 weeks ago. And we focused on learnings from past crises. And we did put together a list of about 10 guidelines for immediate action. And you can see on the slides here that there they are. And these guidelines have proven to be pretty effective, in fact, very effective. You can find them described in more detail on our website, and they are covered in the previous webinar, which is also available on our site. So we were so gratified by the interest of so many that we decided to conduct a series of webinars as we get further into the crisis and more visibility on what the future might hold. For today's webinar, we'd like to focus on what we've learned since the crisis began and formulate a phased approach to both a more stable interim period that we hope is now and soon a return to a new post-COVID world in the not too distant future, again, with our best hope. As Dr. Tom Frieden, the former CDC director, said recently, despite all the talk, we will likely reopen the faucet gradually. I will take a few minutes to review what we know now about the philanthropic response. Then I'm going to ask Pete Hoskow, CCS Principal and Senior Managing Director in Chicago, to share our survey results and outline a phased approach to fundraising in these next phases. And then we'll turn it over to Miriam Droller in New York, our Managing Director, who will take us through the detail of our suggestions and recommendations. And as we said, we'll take a few questions at the end, which we've received from webinar registrants. So what have we learned over the past 5 weeks? Well, we've learned quite a lot. The American nonprofit sector has been impacted dramatically. It has shown both significant vulnerability and great resilience in light of unimaginable stress. All nonprofits find themselves in varying degrees of crisis management and in some cases, existential danger. How has the philanthropic community responded? Well, true to form, despite the dramatic blow to our economy, American families, businesses, and foundations are responding at impressive levels. There have been many individual acts of generosity, as well as coordinated joint responses with funders getting together to address the public health crisis. In addition to urgent healthcare needs, there's been a major focus in the U.S. on food security, with a 46% rise in Americans seeking emergency food supplies, more than 50 million Americans. And there have been both solicited and unsolicited support has been solicited and unsolicited support to help nonprofit organizations in every sector keep up essential services and support their employees and staff. This all adds up to some impressive numbers. According to Candid, which is, you'll remember, the newly merged Foundation Center and GuideStar Group, more than $8 billion in grants have been made in response to the pandemic worldwide. About $1.5 billion has been contributed in the United States. That's according to Candid. And we believe these numbers are significantly underreported numbers, as they don't reflect a complete list of publicized grants or other significant unpublicized commitments that we are well aware of. Where have the funds gone? According to Candid, the funds have gone primarily for disaster relief, disease response and control, medical support, and emergency services. A quarter of the funds have been directed to community and economic development, food aid, education, public information, and public health. Who's doing what? Well, many American companies have announced large commitments. Morgan Stanley, Blackstone, Nike, Facebook, Liberty Mutual, Bank of America, PNC Bank, among others, Ralph Lauren, have committed $10 million or more to COVID-related response. Major philanthropists have made extraordinarily large commitments. Michael and Susan Dell are giving $100 million to their communities, including $20 million for therapeutics. Jeff Bezos has committed $100 million to Feeding America. George Soros has committed more than $130 million to the global response. Hundreds of foundations are on record willing to repurpose their commitments to allow nonprofit organizations to use them for unrestricted, spendable purposes. And it's important to note that many donors are funding programs in areas not previously evident as high priorities for them. And there have been some significant coordinated joint responses, and you can see two here, the $75 million New York City COVID-19 Response and Impact Fund. That's where foundations got together with leading philanthropists to partner with Robin Hood, the New York Community Trust, and the UJA Federation. On a global level, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, MasterCard, Dell, Chan Zuckerberg, and many prominent American, European, and other families have joined with the Wellcome Trust to fund what's called CPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. What a great, catchy name. Often quietly and out of public view, donors big and small are providing funds to pay for food for hospital workers, protective equipment for hospital staff, support for their employees, and also support for the initiatives and just the survival of their beloved nonprofit organizations responding in their own way to the crisis. Since we're very focused on what donors think, how they act, and what they might do, we found a recent Fidelity charitable survey quite interesting, and you can see some of the results here. According to their survey of philanthropic individuals, 25% of donors plan to increase their giving at this time, and 54% say they'll maintain their, kind of current or past giving levels. 80% of donors, roughly 80%, say they're concerned about their nonprofit's ability to operate. A third of respondents say they don't have enough information to direct their support effectively. That's really important. A third of the respondents say they don't have enough information to direct their support effectively for COVID-19 response. Most donors don't plan to shift their giving to different organizations in light of the pandemic. They will continue to support their favorite charities. A quarter of donors say they will give to different organizations as a result of the pandemic. And then we note here as well, in terms of where these funds might go, 58%, 60% say of donors plan to contribute domestically, 11% internationally, and 20% to both equally. Really interesting stuff. So let me wrap up before I turn it over to Pete and share a little bit of what we're seeing here at CCS. As you know, CCS, or you may know, CCS works with about 400 or 500 nonprofit organizations every year. We're working with many organizations on the front line, including, the great urban hospitals like New York Presbyterian, Mount Sinai, NYU Langone, Northwestern Medicine, RWJ Barnabas Health, and we're working with those who are conducting critical research like Weill Cornell, MIT, Rutgers, Baylor, National Jewish Health, and the Weizmann Institute. We also have regular input from literally thousands of nonprofits from all sectors, and this gives us a strong perspective on what's happening in real time throughout our country and our world. And I just wanted to highlight 5 things that we're seeing right now that are, to me, significant. The first is that while we're seeing extraordinary acts of generosity, we also see organizations reticent to appeal for funds. And those organizations that are engaging with their donors are getting strong results and some amazing surprises. So it's really surprised me, and I think it surprised Miriam and Pete as well, that people have been really terrific about this. Second thing we've seen is that the crisis has had an uneven impact on nonprofit organizations, even in the same sector with the same demographics. Organizations of similar size and purpose are experiencing the crisis to different degrees, and this is based on their own economics, their operating models, their staffing structures, their endowments, and their reserves. And we've seen a similar unevenness in the economic fortunes and the psyche of donors. Business owners operating in the same sector are experiencing radically different economic circumstances. A third major finding is that, and I think probably the most important, is that donors and stakeholders are willing and available to talk. They're generally interested in how the crisis is impacting organizations they care about, and virtual briefings in all sectors are well attended, and we see a correlated philanthropic response. So this idea of reaching out, talking to people, giving them a sense of what's happening is extremely important. Another piece of my fourth point is that we're seeing philanthropists now mobilizing to help prepare for the enormous challenges facing our educational institutions this fall. And that's everything from distance learning, housing, travel restrictions, just a host of challenges facing educational institutions. And philanthropists are talking with their organizations to try to figure out how to address that. Finally, we see that astute fundraising professionals recognize that their development operations need to be rethought. The roles and responsibilities of the staff and the deployment of resources require wholesale review, both now and in the longer term. And to this last point, Pete, let me turn it over to you to help us frame our thinking on a phased approach to future fundraising strategies and talk about that survey. So thanks very much, Pete.
Thanks, Bob. It's great to be here with you and Miriam and all the participants. As Bob mentioned, CCS is privileged to be able to partner with upward of 500 nonprofit organizations each year to advance a broad array of fundraising goals. A great deal has happened over the last month and a half. Our sector has no doubt been impacted in a variety of ways. So as we pivot today to focus on the future, it's important to have a plan that reflects all that we've learned during this time and allows us to be nimble to respond to the evolving situation. Our firm's universe of contacts and friends includes tens of thousands of fundraisers across the country and around the world. As we seek to learn more about the impact of this moment on philanthropic strategy, we decided to gather the perspectives of you, those in the field, living the realities of fundraising during COVID-19 every day. With that, our firm launched a philanthropic climate study. We deployed it just a week ago, last Monday, April 20, to help do our part in gathering the insights on how this truly unique situation is shaping decision-making. To date, we've received more than 700 responses from across all sectors, all types of nonprofit organizations, and our data collection efforts will indeed continue. In the next several slides, we wanted to call out the types of trends that we're already seeing and those that we will continue to monitor. We should acknowledge, as Bob said, that there's a great variation in this survey in terms of sector and organization type, and I'll try and call those out in a couple instances. As you see here, we want to reflect back to you the sentiment that was reflected in the survey. To start, these 3 pie charts speak to the overall impact of COVID-19 on fundraising. So across 3 questions here, the impact thus far, the anticipated impact, and the degree of change in appeals. A true high point in these numbers is the more modest impact that's being reported. In our first chart, you see 41% of respondents described only a modest decline. As we look a little bit more deeply into some sector-specific data points, we see that hospitals, health organizations, and human service organizations were more likely to experience an increase. The more modest impact was reported among sectors that we think that we would have thought of as more hard hit, such as religion, performing arts, and culture. However, the second largest share overall, 24% of respondents across all sectors, noted that they are experiencing a significant decline. So there is great variation across all sectors and even in the same sector. There's no one size fits all here. Variance is likely due, as Bob alluded to revenue model, the engagement of organizations' top donors, the region in which they sit. For example, in the South and in the Midwest, respondents were more likely to report a modest increase in fundraising than in the coasts, which in many respects have been harder hit by the COVID crisis. In our middle chart here, we look at the future. We do see an increase in the number of organizations anticipating a significant decline in fundraising, 36%. While many of these respondents are in the education and healthcare sectors, it's interesting to note that associations and cultural institutions in particular are the only 2 sectors where the majority of respondents expect a significant decline in fundraising for 2020. And in the final chart here, most organizations shared that they have maintained about 38% or expanded 27% the appeals that they're carrying forward. Notable exceptions are higher education, and performing arts, whose entire service delivery has been upended as a result of this crisis. This likely speaks to their trepidation to ask for support when their programs have all moved online or they've been suspended altogether. So you can see here, we see a pretty mixed set of reactions in terms of how fundraising appeals are changing. Let's turn to strategy. In the last month and a half, we've shown a light on the power of innovation across our sector. We've been forced to rethink how we can maintain fundraising fundamental best practices while also reacting to the constraints of social distancing. Just today, I saw on the news in the Chicago Tribune a featured article of Mayor Lori Lightfoot, the city of Chicago, teaming up with a cohort of local cultural entities to advance a web-based series called Stay Home, Hit Play, where the mayor is bouncing around town providing virtual field trips of cultural organizations. While making this sort of shift is not a small lift for any fundraising team, the sector has a lot to be proud of in how it's risen to the challenge of this moment. Nonprofits are changing from galas to virtual happy hours, activating gift officers and board members and volunteers, and coordinated efforts to call and engage with donors. We're even seeing a number of our client partners shaping a new take on an old classic, the telethon. We thought those were gone, but we're seeing great success with them. Organizations are really hitting all channels, with large portions of respondents engaging in very personal methods. This first graph shows some of the highlights in the strategies that are being employed in this moment. 359 respondents mentioned the work they're doing making direct appeals to major donors. These types of personal contact points are critical during this time. This theme builds with the data shown in the second chart. More than 500 organizations are making personal calls to speak directly to their supporters. This type of relationship building is a key strategy as well. I'd like to call out the rise of some digital media strategies. It's worth highlighting that when added together, creative virtual engagement opportunities such as briefings, events, and webinars or podcasts have been the most popular method of engaging donors. While this upsurge in digital activity is driven, of course, by these unique times, we think these actions are signs of trends that will be here to stay. The majority of you have launched special emergency appeals during this time, as you see in the right-hand chart, with a fifth of you still considering it. From a sector-specific view, these are most prevalent at organizations that are on the front lines, healthcare and human service organizations. We do also see, however, higher education entities focusing on special appeals where the need to provide added financial assistance has come about, and it's a concern and anticipation that institutions are needing to prepare for a likely decline in revenue as a result of enrollment variances. Let's look now at as we begin to shift to the future, we see two themes that have been very consistent in our data analysis. The importance of staying the course and focusing now more than ever on increasing donor engagement. You'll see these ideas reiterated in the graphs on this page. On the left chart, a strong case for support remains at the forefront. Now, language around COVID programs has made it into the majority of respondents' messaging at this point. Most organizations have changed their case for support in some way. Only 28% report that their case for support remains entirely the same. As it relates to the philanthropic support that is flowing, Bob mentioned some of this. Corporations and foundations have made tremendous gifts across the country and around the globe, and many have stepped up in ways to loosen their grant restrictions and even dip into reserves further than would be regular course. However, individuals remain the primary source of support for nonprofits. Again, tried and true principles are present during this time. As we see here, the majority of support is coming from current donors, major donors, and board members. Finally, on this page, campaigns. Very few of you have canceled or postponed your campaigns. The majority of you, 60%, are continuing campaigns, and 2/3 of that group have modified their campaign in some way. This could be an adjusted timeline or a goal amount, or simply a modification to of the case for support to reflect the current realities in this environment. As we think about our teams and our colleagues and the actions taken towards staffs, a question that is on the mind of so many fundraising program leaders is staff planning. We wanted to touch on this topic during the survey. The majority of organizations have not had layoffs or furloughs, but it's under consideration for many. Based on our research to date, less than 15% of nonprofits have experienced a staff reduction. Only 4.8% have reported significant reductions. There were 12% of respondents that mentioned decision-making is underway. CCS was encouraged with these figures to see that 70% of responses say no layoffs or furloughs were planned. However, we do recognize that this is likely an evolving statistic as the days and weeks of social distancing go on. Some of the strongest staff leaders across our client partners are seeing that a top priority in navigating all that COVID-19 is throwing at us is to take care of our staff. Your fundraising program, we believe, is only as strong as your staff. Keeping them engaged and motivated, developing short-term goals, developing activity goals, and increasing regular communication amongst your team, including digital FaceTime with leaderships, and just overall communication transparency. So now, how will the future unfold as we contemplate various re-emergence scenarios? As we continue to adapt our strategies to fit the latest COVID-19 developments, it's important to turn to re-emergence. While the speed at which society emerges from this crisis will vary, as leaders in the field, we need to turn our attention forward. Based on financial modeling, there are numerous scenarios to explore. Conservative, moderate, or aggressive. Any periodical you pick up will guide you in 1, 2, or 3 of these ways. Some of the most aggressive models we're picking up project re-emergence to begin as early as Q2 of 2020. More conservative models suggest real re-emergence doesn't happen until Q2 of 2021. Really, all that is certain is continued change and uncertainty. Little can be precisely predicted. We do know that there's a lot of fundraising activity that will sit between now and the time of full re-emergence. So we encourage everyone to start thinking and drafting your plan of action now. Finally, some scenario planning and just contemplating the what ifs that are presented to us. To help you evaluate these different what if scenarios, CCS recommends a series of key steps. Gather your decision makers, including a trusted board member or two so you're ready to take quick action. Identify critical streams of philanthropy and philanthropic revenue over the next 6 to 9 months, including how this might have changed due to shifts in things like your earned organizational revenue. Identify the best case, worst case, and middle ground scenarios that apply to your sector, your region, and your organizational dynamics. Assign primary decision makers for each revenue stream and each stream of actions. The idea is to get all your options on the table, activate team members that can see these initiatives forward, and begin building a series of strategies that can be activated based upon how this crisis continues and how it unfolds. So some questions for you to consider are things like, how is society's reemergence from COVID-19 likely to impact my organization? If I am a social service organization, do the demands of my service increase or do they decrease? If I'm a healthcare institution, do I anticipate a resurgence in elective procedures that could expand grateful patient opportunities? What events might be impacted by COVID-19 and how should we switch these approaches? Do I have the tools necessary to maintain a high-functioning digital giving strategy? As we look over the next 9 months, the environment will evolve, and in response, so will your focus on slide 16. We've outlined the characteristics and focus areas brought on by your response to the immediate crisis. Where we need to be turning focus is to stabilization and reemergence. A clear plan of action will be a critical source of support as your leadership team looks to make these pivots. We are adjusting to an ever-evolving new normal. To be ready for whatever is to come, we need to start planning for different scenarios ahead. Allow me to hand the virtual floor to Miriam as she guides us through considerations for fundraising in this new environment. Miriam?
Thanks, Pete. So as fundraisers, we know there are 4 key foundational elements for fundraising success. The first is the case. How do we tell our story? Why our organization and why now? The second is leadership. Who are the people who are telling our story? Certainly institutional leaders and development staff, but we also want to think about the role that volunteers can play during this time and going forward. Third, the prospective donor base. Who are our best prospects at each stage? How do we think about and approach different segments of the donor base? And how do we deepen our reach? Fourth, the plan. What activities and priorities are we pursuing when? We want to define our systematic and methodical approach, or rather redefine it for this new environment. So how do we think about each of these over the course of the phases that Peter introduced? This arc of immediate crisis to stabilization to reemergence. So first, we want to acknowledge that there are still so many unknowns about the evolution of health considerations, which will impact the timing of each of these phases. Timing will be different based on the sector you're in and the nature of your work and when you can reconvene. Certainly, the size of your organizations and the geographic location will also play a role. Today, we want to offer considerations as you plan for this arc of reemergence, thinking about it as response to recovery to resilience. So in this current moment, you've likely already evaluated your immediate needs and the financial shortfalls you're facing and what you will need to prepare yourself for the stabilization period. You've pivoted your services and your programming. You've implemented cost reduction measures. Your fundraising activity is focused on closing short-term gaps, closing this fiscal year, seeking emergency funding from those who are closest to you, mobilizing board support, possibly a broader appeal, and seeking emergency grants that have popped up as well that Bob alluded to. Regarding your messaging, if your organization is on the front lines, you're likely focused on increased direct needs. If you're not on the front lines, you're focused on the financial and programmatic impact of closures in this current moment on your urgent funding requirements and whatever shortfalls you might be facing. You've adjusted the elements of your fundraising plan. You've canceled your spring events or you've pivoted them to online convening. You've adjusted the tone of your annual appeal dramatically. Those of you who rely on benefits-driven support, you're articulating the importance of supporting the mission, even when you might not be able to deliver services in the same ways that you used to. Those of you who are in campaigns are likely to find yourself adjusting the timeline for closing outstanding asks and for starting new conversations. We've all gotten quite adept at leveraging technology in new ways, but we're still adhering to the key principles that Bob reviewed earlier, intensifying our communications, connecting with our donors, thanking them, and keeping them informed. And we've also done a lot of segmentation at the prospect base and starting to develop tailored strategies based on their relationship to us and to the organization. Your leadership that's involved right now is likely internal. Organizational leaders in your development team who are involved in communicating to donors and other stakeholders, and those involved in understanding what the organization's urgent needs are. So now today we want to offer some considerations as some of the uncertainty starts to stabilize and you think ahead to the recovery phase. Organizationally, there are questions you will want to think about and answer. What does our organization look like on the other side? Are we doing a return to pre-coronavirus operations? How do our services or programming change? What are the resources we need to realize this? What is our vision? And how do we redefine the realization of our mission? How do we strengthen the infrastructure and foundation of fundraising in the coming months so that we are able to realize this vision on the other side? What is the muscle that we need to build now? Is it communications? Is it board leadership? Is it refining your programmatic strategic plan? So as we enter the stabilization and recovery phase, some tenets we know will remain the same. Philanthropy is resilient. A mission-centric approach is critical. Fundraising will continue to be relationship-based, and continued communication is the foundation for strong relationship building. Strong leadership will be as important as ever. Organizations who can articulate their needs in the most compelling way will continue to garner support. And segmenting your donor base and developing tailored strategies for each tier will be critical. We also know that we'll have to continue to adapt. We have to anticipate a potential shift. There may be a contraction of some donor segments based on economic impact. There may also be an expansion of others. We need to message new funding priorities as they emerge in our new operations. We want to inspire generosity about a return to activities and impact on the community. We want to present midterm needs and the impact and benefit. We can look to evolve leadership's role. During this phase, we see an opportunity to continue to engage volunteers to help in ways they haven't been engaged to do so before. How can we leverage areas of their expertise to help in organizational planning? How can we mobilize volunteers beyond their generous financial support, positioning them to help us connect with members of our community and steward support? Saying thank you can be so important. We want to look to dive deeper and broaden the prospective donor base. Maintain loyalty among the most committed donors, but also identify opportunities by reassessing and reprioritizing the donor pool based on aligned interests and capacity. We need to continue to segment and focus on how each group can play a role and what recovery funds might there be. How do we see an adjustment to future fundraising plans during this period? As Pete alluded to, online and digital fundraising will continue to be more important. Right now, we're seeing a proliferation of digital engagement strategies, and we anticipate that this will continue as we recover. There are benefits too. For example, thinking about organizations with donors across the country, how might we want to incorporate some of these new types of strategies going forward, not to replace in-person visits, but to complement our activities? We don't yet know what the future role of events-based fundraising will be. It will likely be a long time before a return to what it has been. What can we take from some of the innovations that emerged and the reminder of the unique assets that every organization has to continue to present our mission in a dynamic way? As Peter mentioned earlier, some organizations are reducing capacity and development. With a smaller development structure, we need to think carefully about the restructure of roles and responsibilities. and redeploy assets to support our current strategy. During this stabilization, we will also want to think about resuming campaign activity, reevaluating our priorities and the timeline. As we turn to the re-emergence resilience phase, with a longer establishment of a new normal, there will be a redefinition and recalibration, possibly even a reimagination of your priorities. You'll be able to resume your core operations, but you'll likely need to redefine your offerings and services. And we need to make sure that we develop the fundraising strategy to support this. Messaging that reaffirms your mission and vision, that reflects a re-emergence and an optimism about the future, and inspires generosity. Leadership that continues to play a greater role in fundraising efforts, not only in a personal philanthropic way, but as a true partner to your institution on strategy, on donor engagement, and in developing involvement of others. This supports your longer-term plan. Expand and rebuild the prospective donor base with the economic recovery. And as we think about the defined plan, we know we're going to have to revise the campaign plan. What is the goal? What is the timeline? We need to continue to refine priorities in the case for support. We need to conduct an evaluation of current staffing capacity to support future efforts. Plan for growth and expanded capacity as we can and as is needed. Reconvening. We want to prepare to deepen relationships with donors with the organization and its work. We want to continue to leverage effective tools and strategies developed during the crisis and recovery period. What should events look like in this re-emergence? We want to use information and data collected about the constituents' engagements and interests to inform development of solicitation strategies to deepen their investment going forward and support the future goals of the organization. So as we start to put the immediate crisis behind us, we can begin to think about and plan for the re-emergence. We hope that the considerations we've offered today will enable you to begin to do just that. And with that, we'd like to move on to questions. Thanks again to those of you who've already submitted in advance. And as a reminder, you can submit additional questions through the chat function, and if we don't address them today, we will be sure to follow up.
Miriam, thank you, and thank you to Pete and Bob as well for the presentation, for providing insights and analysis on the data that CCS has collected, also the staged framework for fundraising, and finally, the tangible actions for our partners to consider. We have a long and growing list of really provocative questions, and thank you for expediently pushing through the presentation to leave us enough time to really field the number of these questions. I'm going to assign the first one, Pete, to you. You talked a little bit about special appeals and emergency appeals. So our first question is, while we are certainly continuing our fundraising as energetically as possible, we have so far resisted a campaign for an emergency fund. Can you talk about the merits and the drawbacks of shouting help?
Thanks, Brian. Great question, and I know a question being contemplated, again, across all sectors and organization types. Yeah, going back to the data from the survey, we heard from you that 51% of respondents have established special appeals or funds, an additional 18% are considering it. So the data bears out that this is something that's carefully being considered, again, across all sectors, all types of organizations. And there's no one-size-fits-all answer. We really do believe that first and foremost, this depends on the urgency of the immediate need inside your organization and how that overlaps with your organization's mission, and how this all aligns with your post-COVID strategy and timetable. If you have an urgent immediate need and it's deep into the response of your organization addressing COVID-19 and its implications on the work of your organization, then, yes, a special emergency fund seems reasonable, and it would be fairly easy to argue for it. On the other hand, if there's not a great urgency for immediate funds, and you have plans to launch a future initiative for non-COVID specific needs, it might be advisable to hold off on establishing a fund in the near term. We do believe, though, I think there's a possible middle ground, which would be to keep your stakeholders very well informed in this time about how the crisis is impacting your organization, what you're doing in response, and highlighting examples where donors have done something special. Just that, shining a light on great generosity that has come forth, oftentimes effectively motivates others to see themselves in supporting your continued work. So we hope that that's helpful to the great question, and recognize that it is not a declarative yes or no, but hope the framing serves useful.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. Our next question is, how do we help our boards be more strategic and less reactive during this time? And Bob, I'd love for you to field that one.
Sure, Brian. Thank you. No, this is a really important question, and we all know that boards, can be, thoughtful, well-behaved, and we also know that a couple of voices can influence, a direction, and sometimes those voices are fully informed, and sometimes, they're reacting to one or two experiences. So we think that a few things. One, most boards have been focused on organizational survival, and we're talking about maybe a stabilization period, but for a number of people on this phone, we're not even there yet, right? So we're deep in it, and that has to really be the focus of the boards and how they're financially going to survive and what they see as the challenges going forward. But engaging the board in a strategic exercise, and that, I guess, begins with sharing reliable and up-to-date information and data about philanthropic activity. That's why we're doing this webinar today, and the materials that'll be available for everyone on the webinar will be there for you to share with your boards. And you're able also, not only the information we're sharing, but strategies and the results of peer nonprofit institutions are important to inform a strategy. So engaging the board in a strategic exercise, and not only trying to work towards constructive ways to build and execute a plan, but how they can help would be important. And I think proposing a strategic approach, or at least if that full strategy isn't clear in your own mind, at least outline the factors that should be taken under consideration in the creation of a strategic approach. And in this way, you're beginning to kind of, put the right steps in place to move this in a direction that's better informed, with a board that's fully engaged, where you're setting the agenda for the issues that need to be considered to develop a strong strategy. Thanks, Brian.
Terrific. Thank you, Bob. If you don't mind, I'd love to stay with you, Bob, for this next question. Is now a good time to launch a new major fundraising initiative, such as an endowment campaign or the like?
Wow. I don't know. Maybe not publicly launch something, but I'm finding that this is a really good time to, as has been said, Miriam emphasized it, and Pete, to reaffirm your mission and your vision, to make people aware of what's happening. And if you take something like endowment, if your organization was planning an endowment campaign, this crisis just highlights the importance of a strong endowment. It just really makes the case. And for some organizations coming out of this crisis, they're going to need both endowment and spendable immediate funds. So if you're thinking about an endowment campaign, you might want to, modify it and look at the balance between, spendable funds and pure endowment. A lot of organizations that do endowment campaigns, even if they tell the world they're looking for endowment funds, a number of donors are just going to want to provide spendable funds. So I don't know that I would publicly launch a campaign right at this moment, but I would certainly begin to put together the core elements of a campaign, developing the case, refining your case, modifying it, thinking about the evolution and the development of leadership, developing the prospect pipeline. Miriam talked about that. Quietly securing some leadership support, some early commitments, even potentially matching and challenge gifts, and start to socialize your case with key stakeholders and signal that you have plans to move forward at the appropriate time.
Bob, thank you. Great advice. Let's contrast that a bit with the next question, which is about whether and how we should pivot our annual fundraising efforts. And Miriam, if I could toss that to you.
Sure. So I think adhering to the principles and to the data that Pete shared, in general, we want to stay the course with our fundraising plans, but of course, we're going to have to make some appropriate adjustments to reflect the current environments and how donors will be impacted. We want to continue to focus on the mission of our organization, the important work that the organization does. I think for certain audiences, you can provide a certain level of transparency about the impact of the crisis on the organization and what your plans are in the short and longer term to continue to do the work that you do and the role that philanthropy can play in helping you do that. We all know communication is important, and I think that in terms of your annual funding requests, you want to try to do as much personal outreach, phone calls and that sort of thing before you reach out with funding requests. We've had a number of our clients who have done check-in calls with some of their closest donors, and after having the conversation, obviously the donor's natural reaction is going to be, what can I do to help? The donors really are members of the community, and it's important that we express concern for them. They're going to want to express concern for you to know how the organization and your staff are doing. In the most recent weeks, we've heard from a number of clients who are right now putting together their spring appeals. Certainly the tone will have to reflect the times, but depending on where you are geographically in the country and what is happening around you with the health crisis, you might have to push back the timing of some of those appeals and when it might be appropriate to send some of those communications. Certainly if it's appropriate, you want to recast your case for annual support in light of the impact of what's happening. And there might be some essential needs that are less obvious, but also core to your mission as you go forward. Certainly we want to think about asking for increases from our annual fund donors. In some cases, you might want to accelerate some support. So thinking about people who tend to do their giving later on in the year, there might be an opportunity to secure their gifts earlier. Many of you are thinking about the galas, as I mentioned earlier too, but you need to think about whether an online format makes sense for you as a fundraiser in its own right, and you can ask donors to pivot their gala support in lieu of an event, or if you want to use the event as an engagement opportunity. I just also say that a number of our clients are leveraging matching opportunities, so securing support from either board members or kind of a close cohort of donors, which they're then taking out to the broader audience to try and generate some additional support.
Miriam, if I could stay with you for the next question, because it's a bit of a double click on just a particular segment or two segments of donors. And so the question is, how do you think donor advised funds and private foundation giving will be impacted?
So let me take the foundations piece first. I know a number of foundations have stepped up already. They're keenly aware of the pressure that their grantees are under. So I know we've been talking to a number of our foundation partners. They've made adjustments in terms of their application and reporting processes, and they're offering some real flexibility to their grantees in terms of reallocating programmatic support to general operating, which I know is welcome by the grantees. We're starting to see foundations stepping up with relief funds, as Bob alluded to earlier, and I expect that over the course of the next several weeks and several months, we're going to continue to see more of that. I always urge my clients, sometimes there's a tendency with foundation donors to think about what happens behind the curtain. But, you know, I think foundations want to be organizational partners in this. So I think really treat them as your partners, share with them the concerns that you have and how you're thinking about your future. And they will work with you to help you succeed in that front. Regarding donor advised funds, you know, I point to the FIDELITY data that Bob shared earlier. During previous downturns, those folks who were generous and philanthropic continued to be generous and philanthropic. I think during 2008, we only saw a delta in terms of philanthropy of 5%. From peak to trough in terms of philanthropy drop off. So philanthropy is resilient and donors are as well. In the survey that Bob shared earlier, I think there was a third of the folks planned to increase their donations, and the majority of folks wanted to continue to stay the course. And we know that when there are contractions, people tend to contract the number of organizations that they support, but they continue to be generous to their top philanthropic priorities.
Excellent. Thank you, Miriam. I think we do have time for one final question. And Pete, I'd direct this one to you. Overall, what fundamental tactics should we use to communicate with our donors to build confidence?
Thanks, Brian. Great question. And I think everyone gathered here today can attest to the fact that these last 6 weeks have been a remarkable classroom and learning lab in terms of means of communication and just innovations, frankly. We've been humbled by the creativity and the stick-to-itiveness, if you will, of our client partners across all sectors. It's really been heartening. And, you know, we do believe, I think, as has been proven in past crises that we face, that a crisis is it's an opportunity really to expand and to build upon the relationships you have. It's not a zone in which you're going to have great success seeking and securing new stakeholders, but those that you have, those who have been there for your organization over the years, they want to hear from you. They want to understand how this pandemic is impacting your organization, the delivery of your mission, and how you have been able to respond to those things. That's information that is desired by your key stakeholders. So our best advice is to, you know, be reminded of that, be courageous, be proactive. And in doing that, you know, the work is to demonstrate clearly that you have a thoughtful response plan, and to do so in a way where you're conveying with clarity that that response plan can indeed amplify and extend the mission of your organization. All the while demonstrating the critical relevance of your organization and your work, and you know, really highlighting examples of great generosity. So we are, you know, quite committed to the need to keep on and continue to communicate using the various channels that were identified in the survey. We mentioned that when taken together, the more creative digital outreach methods were the majority of responses provided by survey respondents. We believe pretty firmly that this wouldn't have been the case 8 weeks ago. And it'll make an impact, an indelible impact on the way that we as leaders inside of philanthropy and fundraisers will carry out communication after this pandemic settles and passes. So just some really remarkable and clever and creative outreach tactics. Thanks for the question, Brian.
Pete, thanks for the thoughtful response. Bob, Miriam, Pete, thank you all for the presentation and for the thoughts in response to these provocative questions. We mentioned before that we have a long list of questions. We will absolutely reach out with a response to anyone who submitted a question that we didn't get a chance to address today. I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us today. And as we mentioned earlier, not only will we answer the submitted questions, but we will be sharing a recording of the webinar as well as copies of the slides used during this presentation with everyone who was registered. Thank you again for all that you do, for your leadership, and for your commitment to such important missions. We at CCS hope that above all else, you stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you all again as soon as we can. Take care.